Hi, everybody. Meteorologist Joe Cioffi here on this Monday. Hope you had a great weekend. Had some technical issues yesterday that I had to deal with that kept me from doing a live stream. So I figured I'd do an early one today, and I think I might even do another one tonight at 6 o'clock, so Eastern time, which I'll get into a little bit more for the evening one with regards to weather elsewhere. On this particular live stream, I'm going to focus on the developing blocking pattern that starts to show up late this week and then continues through all of Thanksgiving week and perhaps a little bit beyond that. One of the things we're going to have to look at, well, a couple of things we're going to have to look at is the extent of cold air that the blocking pattern is going to produce. And it does look to me like we're going to have a couple of pretty decent cold shots coming down for next week. So Thanksgiving week does look cold. And the dynamics are there for something to happen in terms of snow somewhere. I think one of the things we'll probably see is the beginnings of some pretty decent lake effect snows throughout parts of upstate New York, for example, along the shores of Lake Erie and Ontario, and maybe even around the Great Lakes as well. I think we're going to see temperatures on the whole below average over the next couple of weeks, although that doesn't mean that there can't be the odd day here and there where temperatures pop up a little bit ahead of whatever cold fronts come through. One of the things I'm going to look at for Sunday is, as this first shot of cold air comes down with a deep trough in the eastern part of the United States, is whether there's some kind of disturbance that's going to rotate around it that might set off a cheap thrill for some coastal areas. And then later next week, I know there's been a lot of chatter about Thanksgiving and something coming down. Models do show something swinging down and around the trough that's going to be in the eastern part of the United States. And it's way too early, of course, to even begin to figure out how real that is and what that means in terms of actual weather. But I think we can certainly explore the possibilities when we look at the upper air. So hang on for 1 second. I'm going to run the weather video, which is, again, not going to be, it's going to be focused more on the upper air and the longer term with the blocking rather than the actual day-to-day weather, although I do touch on that for just a bit. I didn't really get a chance to look at Europe and southeastern Canada at this point, but you folks in southeastern Canada should do pretty well with the snow, so don't worry about that. So hang in there and give me 1 second. I'm going to switch around, and then we'll come back and we'll chat for a bit. I want to spend a little time today just going through the developing pattern change and the blocking pattern that is going to be developing across the northern hemisphere and its impact with regards to the weather going forward, especially as we head into Thanksgiving week. This week in and of itself doesn't really look all that eventful. If we look at, when I say this week, I mean the work week. So if we look at the upper air pattern, we're going to start with the GFS model. We have pretty much west to east flow across the U.S. There's a weak trough that's moving through here in the east today with a little weather with that. You've got an upper low over the west coast, a building high over the Aleutians, and also we have the flow across Canada from west to east. So there's some colder air bleeding down southward, but the upper air flow, for the most part, is one that keeps things, let's call it, close to average, or maybe in some instances as you go a little further north where you're closer to some of the colder air that's around, a little bit below average, but for the most part, right around average. And out in the Atlantic, you have low pressure over most of Greenland aloft, so you have a strong Atlantic jet from west to east. And by the way, this system here has the potential for developing into a subtropical storm, according to the National Hurricane Center. So that will just bring us one more name off the list if that happens. But I'm not going to talk too much about that today. Maybe tonight when I do my regular live stream at 6 o'clock, we'll get into it. So let's watch what happens going forward. Particularly pay attention up in the North Atlantic. You'll have another trough approaching on Thursday in the Northeast, and that's just going to be a reinforcing shot of chilly but dry air. There won't be too much with it. You can see there's a stronger trough that comes into the west. But gradually over the North Atlantic, you start to see that brownish area developed. That's higher pressures in the upper layers of the atmosphere, and this sets the blocking pattern in motion. And the first thing that's going to happen is that it's going to cause a deep trough to form in the eastern part of the United States later next weekend. And this opens up the cold air spigots to some degree out of Canada, although the flow is not coming straight out of northern Canada like it was for last weekend. But this is going to be, a fairly decent shot of cold air, maybe as cold as the one we just saw. And also, there's a lot of energy here with this, and sometimes what happens is you do get little disturbances that rotate around an upper low like this, and could perhaps trigger off some cheap thrill snows for the coast. It could also make for a more important lake effect event going into later next weekend and into early next week. But one thing that happens when you have the block is that things have a tough time getting out of the way. And this upper trough, as we go into Thanksgiving week, doesn't really lift out. It goes up into eastern Canada and rotates around. And you notice, by the way, as we move toward Thanksgiving Day, at least from the standpoint of the GFS, is trying to pick out another system that's dropping southeastward out of Canada. You can see the ridge that builds up from the northwest up northeastward toward Greenland. So all through up here, we've got this brick wall, so nothing can move there, or at least it prevents it from things from moving in its normal west to east fashion. That upper low rotates around, and then we have a new one forming. And actually, the GFS with something like this is not too shabby. This is for the day after Thanksgiving, and then that pulls out, and you still have even going into the last days of the month, you still have some semblance of a northwest flow coming out of Canada, and still some semblance of blocking in Grover, Greenland, although it's a little bit weaker as we go toward the end of the period. But that is really just one of the longer range variables and variations of what you're going to see with weather models, of course, once we get past the 10-day period. The other models are pretty much on board with the same idea with regards to the broad scale pattern, and I will back it up on the European, and we'll watch the block develop on the European, and you can see it there. It's pretty much the same thing. Deep trough in the eastern part of the U.S. for Sunday into Monday, although the structure is a little bit different on the European than it is on the GFS. It's a little more elongated, but you still have this flow that comes out of northwest Canada. Here's your upper high that's building, ridge out in the Atlantic, pretty strong Pacific jet, also evident on the European. And here it is for Tuesday. Now, the European does have the same idea as the GFS here. It does have another trough that's dropping southeastward as this first arm rotates up and out. Still have blocking out in the Atlantic, so this system is not, this profile here is not going to change very much. That upper low in southeastern Canada is going to have a tough time moving east, so it's going to want to rotate around northward. And the European kind of resolves this a little bit differently, but it still has a trough, another trough swinging around a bit faster than the GFS coming into the eastern part of the United States, but it has it coming in on the day before Thanksgiving. And it also has another system upstream here up in northwest Canada that looks like, that might want to dive down southeastward and bring down more cold air. Ridge developing out in the west, so that would is a bullish sign for colder air in the east. And you still have, again, some semblance of a blocking high or a ridge up in Greenland. So it's a very interesting pattern going forward. When we look at, I'm going to go back to the GFS model just to show you what this might mean as far as snow is concerned. And again, you folks who have been with me long enough know that the maps, as we look out through the long range, especially with these snow maps, are not very accurate. We can kind of look at them in the broad sense, but with a pattern like this, it looks like there will be increasing snow cover. And by the way, the snow cover across North America compared to last year is not even close. Snow cover is quite extensive across Canada and into the northern tier of the United States. Wasn't anywhere close like that for the last 2 winters. So I think that's another indicator that this winter is going to be different than last. Here is what the model is showing in terms of snowfall. I would just kind of say, if you want to be conservative, you might want to use just the lighter. When you start to get into the bluish white area, maybe that's where you start to deal with the snow in whatever events where you put some snow on the ground, rather than focus on specific amounts. But you can see some of the darker purples around the Great Lakes, so that I think could be the model reflecting some lake effect event. Of course, significant snows continue through southeastern Canada in a pattern like this, and northwest from there. And still some ample snows going on in western Canada and in the northern Rockies. So the overall pattern with respect to blocking, I think, is going to be it's going to happen, and it is going to open up opportunities with regards to cold weather in the eastern part of the U.S. and the chance for probably, maybe for some places, you'll probably see your first accumulating snows. Why don't we run through the surface map here? And here's today's system that's getting out of the way. You notice there's something coming into the northwest again. As we go into Wednesday, some significant rain and snow there. Weak cold front in the east. We do have then the next system for the weekend, and that's going to bring some showers, and the showers from the Ohio Valley all the way down into the Gulf states as that front approaches the East Coast on Saturday. And then you see behind it a fairly strong shot of colder air. And this is where, I'm talking about sometimes you have to watch these upper lows, because there might be little disturbances. The GFS sort of picks up on one here for Sunday, a little weak system that comes in probably as the marking really the leading edge more of the cold air than anything else, that there might be a little disturbance with that and maybe some snow, and you can see how it generates some lake effect. Yet another system in the northwest, it takes hold. The cold push with the trough in the east like this and the blocking means that the cool air gets all the way down into the southeastern part of the United States. And then, of course, as we head on toward Thanksgiving Day and beyond, that's with that trough later Thanksgiving week that the GFS does something with it. Now, one of the things I'd point out is that when you got these blocking patterns setting up, and you're not going to know this until we get close, but there will be a tendency for these systems, if the blocking is strong enough. We have the model, a few days ago taking something in this track. Now it's kind of trying to do something like this. We could still very well see further south adjustments over time. So that's something that we're going to look and pay attention to with respect to the blocking pattern. And when we look at the temperature profile, and we'll go back on this. Of course, this week again, we see mostly near or a little below average. Then when these fronts approach, you get these brief spikes of above average as you go back out through the plains, below in the west. Here's going into Saturday ahead of that cold front that comes through, and then here comes the cold air for Sunday and into the first part and through Thanksgiving week. We're now into Tuesday, Wednesday, Thanksgiving Day, getting into Thanksgiving Day, and then there's that shot with whatever happens later Thanksgiving week. So, for the most part, it is cold, and you can see how the below normal temperatures of 12 to 16 degrees below normal, the big anomalies that occur down in the from the southern parts of the Mid-Atlantic down to Florida, and then back over through Texas. So this is a very important thing to pay attention to, because if this is the question, I think in the longer range is going to be whether what we're seeing right now, is it a shot across the bow with regards to the longer term pattern? Are we going to see a tendency for blocking going on? Certainly the fact that we have a much deeper snow cover and much further south with the snow cover in Canada and into the United States compared to the last 2 winters apparently is making a difference. It is, significantly colder in Canada this this fall as opposed to last fall, and that is going to perhaps mean that in the longer term we may see this pattern flare up from time to time. All right, folks, I'm going to stop it right here. Just stand by, and we will switch on over. I'm sorry, that was meteorologist Phil Buzz making an appearance on my video. He's going to visit my dog who's back in the kitchen, and Kovu's actually laying right down here, and he's got to go to the vet in a few minutes, so I have to wrap this up. So you folks can see. Whoops. All right, sorry about that. Forgot to switch the audio. So you kind of get a flavor here now of what's going on with respect to the blocking pattern. Blocking patterns are cold patterns for the eastern part of the United States, the eastern half of the United States. This blocking it looks fairly strong. The flow out of Canada looks very strong. My impressions, by the way, in terms of the last couple of winters and what we're seeing now, this is nothing like what we saw the last two winters. This is really a reversion back to something that at least looks more typical of a winter as opposed to ones that are impacted by La Niñas and El Niños. So that's a big difference. And I think, blocking patterns are also unstable. Strength of the block is going to really determine one way or the other with regards to whether there's going to be any kind of storm implications down the road. So I'm going to leave it here at this point, folks. Thanks for joining me this morning. I'm going to be back live streaming tonight, probably a little bit after 6 o'clock. So we'll look at the dayside models and see what they have to offer. And for the areas that I left out with regards to my usual touching upon weather across the pond in Europe and in southeastern Canada, I promise, and in, of course, the western part of the United States and elsewhere, I will take care of that this evening. So be sure to tune in. Meanwhile, just check out latest on Facebook on meteorologist Joe Cioffi, and on my Facebook page, meteorologist Joe Cioffi, and my website, meteorologistjoecioffi.com. Have a great day, folks. We'll see you later.